Welcome to Echoes of WWII, where we explore the real problems America faced in World War II and the solutions that changed history. In the late 1930s, as Europe slid steadily toward catastrophe, the United States looked powerful from a distance, but dangerously unprepared up close. America was rich, vast, and industrialized, yet its military strength lagged far behind the image many would later project onto it. The country that would eventually overwhelm the Axis powers with sheer production had not yet decided whether it even wanted to fight. To understand why, one must forget the America of 1944 and return to the America of 1939. At that moment, Nazi Germany had already absorbed Austria, dismantled Czechoslovakia, and was preparing for a full-scale war. Japan had been fighting brutally in China for years. Britain and France were mobilizing, rearming, and bracing for impact. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States watched, uneasy, concerned, but still largely detached. On paper, America seemed unstoppable. It had the world's largest economy, abundant natural resources, and a population nearing 130 million. Its factories produced cars, refrigerators, radios, and steel in quantities no other nation could match. Yet none of this automatically translated into military power. In reality, the U.S. Army in 1939 ranked somewhere between 17th and 19th in the world, smaller than the armies of Romania and Portugal. It had fewer than 200 modern tanks, many of them obsolete. American pilots trained in aircraft that would have been outclassed almost immediately in European skies. Ammunition stockpiles were thin, logistics underdeveloped, and large-scale mobilization plans barely tested. This weakness was not an accident, it was a choice. The shadow of World War I still loomed large over American society. The war had been sold as the war to end all wars, yet it ended with disillusionment, economic disruption, and the loss of over 100,000 American lives. In the years that followed, many Americans came to believe that entering the conflict had been a tragic mistake, one driven by European rivalries and profiteering arms dealers rather than true national interest. By the 1920s and 1930s, this belief hardened into policy. The United States embraced isolationism, not as cowardice, but as self-protection. Congress passed a series of neutrality acts designed to prevent the nation from being dragged into another foreign war. These laws restricted arms sales, loans, and even travel to belligerent nations. At the same time, the country was fighting a different battle at home. The Great Depression had devastated American life. By 1933, unemployment hovered around 25%. Banks collapsed, farms failed, and entire communities were pushed to the brink. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal aimed to restore hope, dignity, and economic stability. But it required massive public investment. Every dollar spent on tanks was a dollar not spent on jobs, relief, or recovery. Rearmament, to many Americans, looked not only unnecessary but irresponsible. Public opinion reflected this mood. Polls throughout the late 1930s showed overwhelming opposition to entering another European war. The oceans, many believed, were natural shields. Let Europe solve Europe's problems was a common sentiment. Even as Americans sympathized with Britain or felt alarmed by Hitler's aggression, they were not ready to send their sons overseas again. This reluctance shaped military planning. The armed forces were kept small, professional, and underfunded. War was seen as a distant possibility, not an urgent reality. America was wealthy, but it was not armed. And yet, beneath this apparent weakness lay something far more important than tanks or planes. America still possessed its greatest weapon, capacity. The factories were there, the engineers were there, the raw materials were there. The workforce, idle, underemployed, eager, was there. What was missing was not ability, but activation. The United States was like a massive engine running at idle, powerful, but disengaged. Franklin Roosevelt understood this better than anyone. Long before Pearl Harbor, he grasped a critical truth. If war came, America would not win by matching Germany or Japan tank for tank in 1939. It would win by transforming itself, by turning its economic strength into military power at a scale the world had never seen. But first, the sleeping giant had to wake up. America's unpreparedness for World War II did not come from ignorance or incompetence. It came from logic shaped by memory, fear, and democratic restraint. To understand why the nation entered the most destructive war in human history with outdated weapons and a small army, one must look not at what America failed to do, but at what it deliberately avoided doing. After World War I, the United States did not celebrate victory for long. Instead, it questioned the cost. The human losses were sobering, but the political aftermath was even more disillusioning. Europe remained unstable. Old empires collapsed. New conflicts simmered. Many Americans concluded that their sacrifices had changed very little. This belief was reinforced in the 1930s by investigations such as the WWII Committee, which suggested that arms manufacturers and financial interests had pushed the United States into World War I for profit. Whether entirely fair or not, this narrative deeply influenced public opinion. War was no longer seen as a noble crusade. It was seen as a trap. As a result, peace became policy. Isolationism was not simply a popular mood. It was institutionalized through law. Between 1935 and 1937, Congress passed multiple neutrality acts. These laws prohibited arms sales and loans to nations at war and restricted American involvement in overseas conflicts. Even Roosevelt, who privately feared the rise of fascism, was constrained by Congress and the electorate. In a democracy, leaders cannot prepare for war openly when voters demand peace. This created a paradox. As the world grew more dangerous, America tied its own hands. Military planners knew the armed forces were underpowered. Reports warned that U.S. aircraft were inferior to European designs, that tank doctrine lagged behind Germany's blitzkrieg concepts, and that supply chains were fragile. Yet funding remained limited. The military was expected to be ready for war without appearing to prepare for one. The Great Depression compounded this problem. The crisis was not abstract. It was visible on every street. Breadlines, shuttered factories, and desperate families dominated American life throughout the early 1930s. When Roosevelt took office in 1933, his political mandate was clear: fix the economy. The New Deal focused on jobs, infrastructure, and social stability. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration put millions to work. Dams, roads, and schools were built. This was nation building, but it was not rearmament. From a public perspective, tanks did not feed families. Bombers did not stop foreclosures. The idea of spending billions on weapons while millions were unemployed felt morally wrong to many Americans. Economic recovery came first. Defense would have to wait. There was also a deeper cultural assumption at play: time. Americans believed they would see war coming in advance. Unlike European nations, they did not share borders with hostile powers. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were seen as buffers that would provide years of warning before any direct threat emerged. If rearmament became necessary, many assumed it could be done later, quickly. This assumption was both correct and dangerously incomplete. It was correct in the sense that America truly did have time. The Axis powers would not be able to reach the U.S. mainland in the early years of the war. But it was incomplete because modern war moves faster than societies expect. Training soldiers, building ships, designing aircraft. These processes take years, not months. Still, until 1940, the political cost of early rearmament seemed higher than the perceived risk of delay. Roosevelt walked a careful line. Publicly, he reassured voters that he would keep America out of war. Privately, he searched for ways to prepare without provoking backlash. The first cracks in isolationism appeared after Germany's invasion of Poland and the fall of France. Suddenly, Britain stood alone. At that moment, the central question shifted. It was no longer whether America would fight, but how it could help without fighting yet. This is where Roosevelt's strategic genius began to show. He understood that the United States could engage the conflict indirectly, through production. Weapons could cross oceans even if soldiers could not. Factories could act where armies could not. America might not be ready to send troops, but it could begin to send tanks, planes, trucks, and ammunition. This approach would buy time, strengthen allies, and, most importantly, prepare American industry for the possibility of full-scale war. In short, America was not ready because it did not want to be ready too soon. But once the decision to prepare was made, it would not be half-hearted. The stage was set for a transformation unlike anything the world had ever seen. Not on the battlefield, but on the factory floor. In December 1940, nearly a year before Pearl Harbor, Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the American people in one of the most consequential speeches of the 20th century. The United States was still officially at peace, but the president spoke with unmistakable urgency. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," he declared, arguing that America's survival depended not only on defending itself, but on supplying those already fighting tyranny. This was more than rhetoric. It was a strategy. Roosevelt understood that America's greatest advantage was not its army or navy, but its industrial capacity. The country might be late to military preparation, but it possessed something no other nation could match: a vast, flexible manufacturing system capable of being repurposed at extraordinary speed. If activated correctly, it could overwhelm any enemy, not with brilliance, but with volume. The challenge was enormous. In 1940, American industry was optimized for consumer goods, not war. Auto plants produced cars, not tanks. Appliance factories built refrigerators, not machine guns. Entire supply chains would need to be redesigned. Workers would have to be retrained. New materials, new standards, and new management structures would be required. To lead this transformation, Roosevelt turned to industry itself. One of the most important figures in this effort was William S. Knudsen, former president of General Motors. Knudsen was not a general or a politician. He was a production expert. He believed that war could be won the same way cars were sold, through standardization, simplification, and mass output. Appointed to oversee defense production, Knudsen brought private sector efficiency into government planning. His philosophy clashed sharply with European military traditions. Germany, for example, prized precision engineering and constant model improvements. Its tanks and aircraft were technologically impressive, but complex, expensive, and slow to build. America took a different approach. Designs were simplified, parts were standardized, perfection was sacrificed for speed. The result was revolutionary. Automobile companies became the backbone of wartime production. Ford's Willow Run plant, built from scratch, eventually produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. General Motors manufactured aircraft engines, tanks, and weapon systems at unprecedented rates. Chrysler built massive tank arsenals. Even companies like Singer, known for sewing machines, produced firearms. The conversion was not limited to machines. It transformed society. Millions of Americans entered the industrial workforce. Women, previously excluded from heavy manufacturing, became essential. Rosie the Riveter was not a slogan. She was reality. Farmers became machinists. Office workers learned to operate lathes. The war economy absorbed the unemployed and reignited American confidence. Government policy made this possible. Washington did not merely issue orders, it partnered with business. Companies received advance payments, guaranteed contracts, and tax incentives to retool. The risk of failure was socialized. The responsibility for execution remained private. This partnership created a feedback loop of innovation, speed, and scale. Equally important was the Lend-Lease program. Through it, the United States supplied Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and other allies with enormous quantities of material, long before American troops entered combat. Trucks, locomotives, aircraft, food, fuel, and ammunition flowed across oceans. These supplies did not just help allies fight. They bought time. Time was America's most precious resource. While British pilots defended the skies and Soviet soldiers bled on the Eastern Front, American factories learned how to produce war. Mistakes were made early. Bottlenecks appeared. Quality issues emerged. But unlike the Axis powers, the United States could afford to experiment, correct, and expand simultaneously. By 1942, the transformation was complete. What had begun as an emergency response became a production juggernaut. The United States was no longer catching up. It was pulling ahead. This approach reshaped warfare itself. Victory no longer depended solely on battlefield tactics or heroic commanders. It depended on logistics, replacement rates, and the ability to sustain pressure indefinitely. American tanks did not have to be better than German tanks. There simply had to be more of them, every month, every year. And there were. Ships crossed the Atlantic in endless convoys. Planes filled the skies. Ammunition never ran out. When losses occurred, replacements arrived. The Axis powers, constrained by resources and bombed factories, could not keep pace. By turning production into strategy, America changed the rules of the war. It proved that in the industrial age, wars are not won only by those who fight best, but by those who build fastest. The arsenal of democracy was not a metaphor. It was a system. And once it reached full power, it became unstoppable. By the height of World War II, the outcome of the conflict was no longer determined solely by battles and generals. It was determined by schedules, shipping manifests, and production quotas. The war was being decided far from the front lines, in American factories that never slept. By 1944, the scale of U.S. industrial output was staggering. The United States was producing nearly half of all military equipment used by the Allied powers. More than 300,000 aircraft rolled off assembly lines. Tens of thousands of tanks were built. Liberty ships, simple, standardized cargo vessels, were launched faster than German submarines could sink them. Ammunition, fuel, food, and vehicles flowed in quantities no enemy could match. This abundance reshaped the war itself. On the Eastern Front, Soviet armies depended heavily on American-made trucks, locomotives, radios, and food supplied through Lend-Lease. While Soviet factories produced tanks and artillery, it was American logistics that allowed those forces to move, communicate, and sustain offensives. As one Soviet officer later remarked, the Red Army rode to Berlin on American wheels. In Western Europe, Allied strategy assumed something unprecedented: constant resupply. When American and British forces landed in Normandy, they did so with the confidence that replacements would arrive faster than losses could accumulate. Planes could be lost and rebuilt. Ships could be sunk and replaced. This industrial certainty allowed commanders to take risks the Axis could not afford. Germany and Japan fought differently, not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they lacked margin. Their production systems were rigid, resource-constrained, and increasingly under attack. German engineers continued to design technically superior weapons, but factories could not produce them in sufficient numbers. Japan, cut off from raw materials and oil, simply ran out of options. America did not. This imbalance created a psychological shift. Axis commanders knew that every loss hurt them more than it hurt the Allies. American soldiers knew that their nation stood behind them with overwhelming material support. Morale, often overlooked, became another industrial product. By 1945, the result was clear. The Axis powers were exhausted, their economies were shattered, their armies were outnumbered, outsupplied, and outlasted. The United States, by contrast, emerged not only victorious, but transformed. The war ended the Great Depression. Full employment became the norm. Technological innovation accelerated. Entire industries, aviation, electronics, nuclear energy, leaped forward. America possessed the world's strongest military, its largest economy, and its most advanced industrial base. This was not an accident of geography or fate. It was the consequence of mobilization. The deeper lesson of the arsenal of democracy is not that America was always strong. It is that America learned how to become strong quickly, without abandoning its political system. Unlike totalitarian states, the U.S. did not mobilize through fear alone. It mobilized through incentives, partnerships, and shared purpose. Democracy proved capable of speed when survival was at stake. This lesson would shape the post-war world. The United States used its industrial power to rebuild Europe through the Marshall Plan, prevent economic collapse, and contain new threats. Military production capacity became the backbone of American global leadership. The techniques refined during World War II, standardization, scale, logistics, became permanent features of American power. Yet there is also a warning embedded in this story. America did not enter World War II prepared. It entered late, hesitant, and under-equipped. Had events moved faster, or had Britain fallen earlier, the cost of delay might have been catastrophic. Industrial power is decisive, but only if it is mobilized in time. In the end, World War II demonstrated a fundamental truth of the modern world. Wars are not won by strength alone, but by the ability to convert potential into reality. America's factories did not merely support the war effort, they defined it. The United States did not win because it started strong. It won because it learned, adapted, and produced faster than anyone else. That is the real meaning of the arsenal of democracy, and why the 20th century became, unmistakably, the American century.